The city streets pulsed with life under the golden hues of the setting sun. People rushed home, headlights flickered on, and the faint scent of rain lingered in the air, a remnant of the afternoon drizzle. Amidst the everyday chaos, a routine traffic stop was unfolding, a moment so ordinary that no one would suspect it would soon become a story that would shake the entire community. But before we dive into what happened next, make sure to like, share, and subscribe because this story is about to take a turn you won't see coming. Officer Daniel Foster tightened his grip on his ticket pad as he approached the old, slightly dented Chevrolet parked on the side of the road. His polished black boots clicked against the wet pavement. It was a routine traffic violation, nothing more, an expired parking meter. But as he neared the driver's side, something about the man behind the wheel caught his attention. The driver, an elderly black man with deep wrinkles that told stories of decades past, sat quietly, hands resting on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His silver hair was neatly cropped, and his dark brown skin bore the marks of time and wisdom. He wore a simple button-down shirt, its sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal a forearm lined with faded scars. "License and registration," Foster said, his tone firm but uninterested. The old man nodded, moving slowly and deliberately as if each action carried weight. His hands didn't shake, no nervousness, no hesitation, just the practiced movements of a man who had likely been in this situation before. He reached into his glove compartment, pulled out a leather wallet, and handed over his documents without a word. Foster barely glanced at the name before flipping to the expiration date. Expired. Just as he suspected. Another violation. He clicked his pen and started writing the ticket. "You know your license is expired, right?" he asked, looking up. The old man nodded again. "Yes, sir. Working on getting it renewed." His voice was deep and steady, with a kind of quiet authority that didn't match the frailness of his age. Foster wasn't moved. He had dealt with too many excuses over the years, and this was just another name to add to the list. Rules were rules. "You also overstayed at the parking meter," Foster added, jotting down the second violation. The old man sighed but didn't argue. He just sat there, watching the officer with eyes that held decades of wisdom. Foster finished writing the ticket, tore it from his pad, and was about to hand it over when he noticed another card tucked behind the man's driver's license. It was old, laminated, and slightly frayed at the edges. A military ID. Foster hesitated for a moment. He wasn't unfamiliar with these cards, he had seen plenty before. But something about this one made him pause. The name on it matched the one on the license, but it was the title underneath that sent a chill up his spine. It read, Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Warren, United States Marine Corps, retired. His breath caught. His heart pounded in his chest. His grip on the ticket tightened. Lieutenant Colonel? A retired Marine? Foster's mind raced. The old man hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't tried to use it as an excuse, hadn't pleaded for sympathy, hadn't even hinted at his past. He had just sat there, quietly accepting his fate. The officer felt a sudden weight settle on his shoulders. The name, Elijah Warren, sounded oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Still, a retired officer of such high rank? That wasn't something you saw every day. "Sir, you served?" Foster asked, his voice unintentionally softer. Elijah Warren gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A long time ago. There was no pride in his voice, no arrogance. Just a simple statement of fact. Foster swallowed hard, his mind spinning with questions. Who was this man? Why did his name sound so familiar? And why, despite being ticketed, did he sit there as if he had already seen and endured much worse? Something about this didn't feel right, and that was when everything changed. Officer Daniel Foster's fingers trembled slightly as he held the ticket, his eyes darting between the name on the military ID and the man sitting in front of him. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Warren. The name echoed in his head, scratching at something buried deep in his memory, something he couldn't quite grasp. The air between them grew heavier, the once simple traffic stop now carrying an unexpected weight. Foster swallowed hard, unsure why a creeping sense of unease was settling into his bones. He had issued thousands of tickets before. Why did this one feel different? "You were a Marine?" Foster finally asked, his voice quieter than before. Elijah Warren simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "Served 30 years, he said, his voice steady. "Retired a long time ago." Foster's grip tightened on the ticket. 30 years. That wasn't just a career, That was a lifetime. He had met veterans before, but few had served that long, and even fewer had reached a rank as high as lieutenant colonel. It wasn't just the years of service that struck him, though. It was the calm way Warren carried himself, the silent dignity in his posture. This wasn't just any retired officer. And yet, the man sat there without protest, accepting the ticket as if it was nothing more than an autumn leaf falling at his feet. No complaints, no excuses, just quiet acceptance. Foster's training kicked in. He had been taught to maintain authority, to never let emotions dictate his actions. But something inside him twisted uncomfortably. His job was to uphold the law, yet standing here in front of this man, this war-hardened soldier who had given decades of his life to serve a country that didn't always serve him back, made the ticket in his hand feel like an insult. Clearing his throat, Foster tried to focus. "Where did you serve?" he asked, not even sure why he was continuing the conversation. Elijah's gaze met his for the first time, and for a moment Foster felt as if the old man was looking through him rather than at him. Then finally the retired Marine spoke. "Vietnam. Beirut. Desert Storm." The words hit Foster like a freight train. 3 wars. 3 different decades. 3 different hells. Foster wasn't old enough to remember the Vietnam War, but he had heard the stories. He had learned about the brutal conditions, the relentless jungle, the soldiers who had been sent to fight a war that many back home didn't even support. He had heard about the Beirut barracks bombing in '83, the devastating attack that had killed 241 American service members in a single moment. And Desert Storm? That was history too. A swift war, but not without its costs. He inhaled sharply, glancing back down at the military ID as if seeing it for the first time. The expiration date confirmed what he had already guessed: Warren had been retired for decades. But that didn't make his service any less significant. If anything, it made it more so. Foster had been a cop for nearly 10 years. He had dealt with all kinds of people, some who deserved his respect, some who didn't. But looking at the man in front of him, he suddenly felt small. He had sworn an oath to protect and serve, but Warren had sworn an oath too, one that had taken him to battlefields halfway across the world. One that had likely cost him more than Foster could ever understand. A strange mix of emotions churned inside him. Respect. Guilt. Shame. He had approached this stop like any other. A simple expired parking meter violation. A routine citation. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just disrespected a man who had given more for his country than most ever would. Foster cleared his throat, trying to shake off the unease. "Sir, Aya?" Before he could finish, the sound of a car horn blared from behind him. Another officer, his partner for the evening, was parked a few feet away, waiting. He was watching Foster curiously, probably wondering why this simple stop was taking so long. Foster exhaled. He was overthinking this. Rules were rules. The law didn't make exceptions based on someone's past. He had a job to do. He extended the ticket through the driver's side window. "You'll need to take care of this within 30 days, he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Warren took the ticket without a word. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for leniency. He simply folded the slip of paper in half, tucking it neatly into his wallet next to his military ID. Foster hesitated, still gripping his notepad. Something inside him told him to apologize. Something else told him to walk away. Before he could decide, Warren spoke again. "You ever serve, officer?" The question caught him off guard. Foster stiffened. "No, sir." Warren nodded as if he had already known the answer. "Then you wouldn't understand." Understand what? Foster wanted to ask. But the weight in Warren's voice made him pause. There was no bitterness in it, no accusation, just a simple truth. For some reason, that made it worse. Foster turned to leave, but as he did, something in his gut told him this wasn't over. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But somehow, someway, this traffic stop was going to come back to haunt him. Foster sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than he needed to. The traffic stop was over, but his mind refused to let it go. His partner, Officer Greg Hansen, gave him a sideways glance. "What was that about?" Hansen asked, leaning back in his seat. Foster shook his head. "Nothing. Just an expired license and a parking violation." Hansen scoffed. "Took you long enough? Thought the old guy was giving you a hard time." "No," Foster muttered. "He didn't." And that was the problem. Most people argued over tickets, even minor ones. They pleaded, made excuses, or got defensive. But Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Warren had done none of that. He had simply accepted it. The kind of quiet acceptance that came from a man who had seen worse things than a cop writing a citation. Foster could still hear Warren's voice. You wouldn't understand. The words lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. There had been something about the way Warren said it, something that made Foster feel like a kid being spoken to by an elder who had already seen the end of the story. The name, too. It nagged at him. He had heard it before, he was sure of it. But where? Shaking his head, he turned the ignition. Let's get back on patrol. The rest of the evening went by in a blur. A few noise complaints. A fender bender. A domestic disturbance that ended before it began. The usual. But even as Foster moved from call to call, his mind kept returning to the old Marine. By the time his shift ended, he couldn't ignore it anymore. Back at the station, Foster sat at his desk, logging his reports. But before signing out for the night, he opened his browser and typed the name that had been bothering him all day. Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Warren. A few articles popped up. Some military records. A couple of obituaries for other men with similar names. Nothing major. Then he saw it. A link to an old newspaper article nearly 3 decades old. His heartbeat quickened as he clicked on it. The headline read, Heroic Marine saves dozens in Beirut bombing, sacrifices everything to bring them home. Foster's breath hitched as he read. Elijah Warren had been in the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, the same barracks that had been bombed in one of the deadliest attacks on U.S. forces at the time. The explosion had killed 241 service members. But Warren? He had survived. And not just survived, he had saved people. The article detailed how, despite his own injuries, Warren had pulled at least 7 men from the rubble before medics had forced him to stop. He had suffered burns, broken bones, and a collapsed lung but refused to be airlifted out until his men were accounted for. Foster's stomach turned. The man he had just fined for an expired parking meter had once crawled through burning debris to save lives. He scrolled further. Warren had returned to service after recovering. He had led missions in Desert Storm. He had trained younger Marines, shaping the next generation. And then, after retiring, he had quietly disappeared from public life. No flashy interviews, no political endorsements. Just a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. And Foster had written him a ticket. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. No wonder Warren hadn't argued. No wonder he had just accepted it. He had been through worse. Much worse. Foster ran a hand down his face. He had spent years enforcing the law, believing in rules, in order. But for the first time, he felt like he had just disrespected someone who had earned the right to be treated differently. He had to make this right. Without hesitation, he grabbed his jacket, clocked out, and headed for his car. He didn't know where Warren lived, but the address from the ticket was still fresh in his mind. He was going to find the old Marine. And he was going to fix this. The night air was crisp as Foster pulled up to the address listed on the ticket. It was a modest single-story home on the outskirts of town. The kind of house that had seen decades of quiet living. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the front steps, and the American flag fluttered gently on a pole near the door. Foster sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. What was he even going to say? Hey, sorry for writing you a ticket. I didn't realize you were a war hero. That sounded pathetic. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew he couldn't just let this go. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car and walked up the front path. He hesitated for only a second before knocking firmly on the door. A few seconds passed before he heard movement inside. Then the door creaked open, and there he was, Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Warren. The old man studied him for a long moment, his sharp eyes glinting under the porch light. He wasn't surprised to see Foster, but he wasn't exactly welcoming either. Officer, Warren said, his voice even. Did I miss a fine or something? Foster swallowed. No, sir. I just wanted to talk. Warren didn't move at first. Then, with a slow nod, he pushed the door open wider. Come on in. The inside of the house was simple but filled with history. Old books lined the shelves. Framed photographs sat neatly on a side table. Foster's eyes scanned the room, stopping on a collection of medals encased in a glass frame. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star, and at the center a Navy Cross. Foster stiffened. A Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. He had found a man who had nearly given his life for his country. Warren noticed his gaze. Did your research, huh? Foster turned, guilt tightening in his chest. Yes, sir. I did. The old Marine walked over to the cabinet, pulling out 2 glasses. He poured a small amount of whiskey into each, then set one down in front of Foster. Sit. Foster hesitated but eventually took the seat across from him. He picked up the glass but didn't drink. I read about Beirut, he finally said. About what you did. Warren sipped his drink, his expression unreadable. That was a long time ago. Foster shook his head. Doesn't change what you did. He exhaled, gripping the glass. I shouldn't have written you that ticket. Warren chuckled lightly, shaking his head. You were doing your job. Foster leaned forward, his voice laced with regret. It wasn't just a job this time. I should have taken a second to actually see you, to recognize who you are. The old man's gaze softened, but there was still something unreadable in his expression. And what would you have done if you had? Foster hesitated. He knew the answer. He wouldn't have written the ticket. But something about that felt wrong, too. I don't know, he admitted. But I know I would have shown more respect. Warren studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Respect isn't about bending the rules when it suits you. It's about treating everyone the same, whether they're a decorated Marine or a kid working his first job. Foster clenched his jaw. I understand that. But you deserve better than a. Then what? Warren interrupted. Being held to the same rules as everyone else? Foster didn't know how to respond. Warren sighed, setting his glass down. I spent my life following orders, Officer Foster. I lived by structure, discipline, accountability. I never wanted to be treated special. And I sure as hell don't expect a free pass just because I served. Foster frowned. But after everything you sacrificed, I sacrificed because I chose to, Warren cut in. I wore the uniform because I believed in something greater than myself. And part of that belief? It meant that when I came back home, I was just another citizen. Just like you. Silence filled the room. Foster had come here expecting to make amends, to fix what he had done. But sitting in front of this man, he realized something else. Warren didn't want to be treated like a hero. He just wanted to be treated like everyone else. The weight in Foster's chest shifted. He had spent so much time feeling guilty about the ticket, thinking it was a mistake, when in reality Warren had never seen it that way. Finally, he let out a slow breath. I get it now. Warren gave him a knowing look. Good. They sat in silence for a moment before Foster finally lifted his glass and took a sip. The warmth of the whiskey burned down his throat, but he barely noticed. Because for the first time since that traffic stop, he felt like he had actually learned something. The drive back to the station felt different. Foster had come to Warren's house expecting to make things right, but he hadn't expected to walk away with a lesson he hadn't known he needed. Back at the precinct, the night shift was winding down and the air inside was thick with the usual end-of-shift chatter. Officers swapped stories, filled out paperwork, and checked the clock, counting down the minutes before they could go home. But Foster barely heard any of it. His mind was still back in that small, quiet house, sitting across from a man who had been to war and back, who had faced death and walked away not looking for gratitude but for normalcy. Hanson spotted him and raised an eyebrow. You good, man? You've been quiet. Foster hesitated. Then, surprising even himself, he said, You ever hear of Elijah Warren? Hanson frowned. Can't say I have. Why? Foster sat down at his desk, running a hand through his hair. I pulled him over tonight. Gave him a ticket for an expired meter. Hanson snorted. So? Foster sighed, shaking his head. So, he's a war hero. Beirut bombing survivor. Saved a bunch of Marines. Silver Star, Navy Cross, you name it. That got Hanson's attention. Wait, that Elijah Warren? The guy from the bombing. Foster nodded. Hanson let out a low whistle. Damn. And you ticketed him? Foster exhaled. Yeah. Hanson chuckled. Man. I bet you feel like an idiot. Foster smirked. But it faded quickly. I did. But then I talked to him. Hanson leaned forward. And? Foster thought about it for a moment. Then said, he didn't want an apology. Didn't want a free pass. Just wanted to be treated like anyone else. Hanson scoffed. Still, I mean, a guy like that deserves some kind of... That's exactly what I thought. Foster cut in. But that's not how he sees it. He didn't serve for special treatment. He did it because he believed in something bigger than himself. And part of that belief means being held to the same rules as everyone else. Hanson shrugged. I guess I get that. Foster tapped his fingers against his desk. It's funny. We wear this badge, thinking we understand service. But that man, he lived it, and he didn't expect anything in return. Hanson didn't say anything, neither did Foster. But in that quiet moment, something shifted. Foster had always taken pride in his job, in upholding the law, in enforcing the rules. But tonight, he had seen a different kind of duty, one that didn't come with sirens or citations. It was the kind of duty that had cost Warren everything, and yet, he still carried it like a quiet, unshakable force. Foster reached into his pocket, pulling out a spare notepad. Without overthinking it, he wrote down the words Elijah Warren, Beirut, 1983, and tucked the paper into his wallet. A reminder, a lesson, because from this night forward, he would never look at service, sacrifice, or respect the same way again. And that was worth more than any ticket.